welcome to the Semgrep Community event. Today, we're going to dive deep into collaborating with development teams and how to successfully implement and enforce secure guardrails. I'm Charissa Kim, a security TPM at Semgrep, and I'm thrilled to be your guys' host. Joining me are our amazing and well-accomplished panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience. So let's have them introduce themselves, starting off with Patrick.
Hey, I'm Pat. Yeah, thank you. I'm Patrick Garrity. I take on a lot of different roles in early stage startups. Right now, I'm a security researcher at Vulncheck, and then previously helped build Duo Security, Blumira, Census, and I'm missing one other one, Nucleus Security. So have a lot of experience working with product teams and dev teams.
Wow. Tanya, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm probably not supposed to fawn over the other panelists. So I work at Semgrep. I'm the head of community and education, and my name's Tanya Janca, and I'm also known as She Hacks Purple. And yeah, I was a dev a long time, then I started working in AppSec, and then I kept talking about it a lot. And then now I do sort of developer relations-y community types of things as a result of talking too much.
There's no such thing as talking too much, honestly. We love that when you talk more. Kurt, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Kurt Boberg. I'm a staff security researcher here at Semgrep. I was sort of the research lead of our supply chain product. Before I was at Semgrep, I built Chegg's AppSec program, and then before that, I was AppSec and what is now considered DevOps at DocuSign. It was a long time ago, so DevOps wasn't really a thing, but I pushed bits around onto bare metal data center stuff.
Wow, we have so many intelligent, very awesome, cool people on this panel. I'm so excited to get it started. Also, for the viewers, if you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll make sure to include it in the panel. So feel free to speak your thoughts in mind and let's get started. Okay, is everyone ready? All of our amazing panelists? Okay, we will kick it off. Okay, so starting off with the first question. It might seem a little too basic, but hopefully it's not. What is a secure guardrail? Like, what does that mean to you? If anyone wants to kick it off first.
I mean, I just think basically, some form of control or security control in place, ensuring that, when code's being developed and shipped, that like it meets a certain form of quality. And that could be like security. It also could be like other aspects of development to make sure that it's secure and consistent. I don't know.
Kurt, did you want to add to that by any chance?
Yeah, I've spent so much time in like developer world that I have a very code specific take on this, and I tend to think about it as a safe by default piece of functionality that is a drop-in as good or better replacement for baseline risky language or framework functionality. An example from like my career is DocuSign has an internal XML wrapper because it's a very old piece of software and it was built before there were like built-in language protections around things like external entity injection. So we just built a wrapper around that configured the parser correctly, and it was easier to instantiate than the default language parser. So it was easier to use than the dangerous version, and developers loved that. And it also makes it easier to detect with static analysis, because if it's not the wrapper, you can yell at people.
Can I add on to that?
Of course, go ahead.
So I feel like, I agree with both of you, or maybe I'm asking a follow-up question, I don't know, but like, I feel that a secure guardrail, the idea is to kind of like try to get you to go back to a secure default or like make the right choice. But sometimes you can still kind of break out of it. If you're a developer, like we're like water, we can kind of go around and do whatever we want, really. So I kind of view it as like it's trying to get us to do the right thing, but sometimes people still are like, nah. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I think it's true to some extent. It depends on the tool or like what guardrails in place. But yeah, generally speaking, I don't think there's any perfect guardrail per se. And naturally, humans often will gravitate towards doing the thing that's easiest to get the job done, right? And maybe the product requirement isn't so much about security as it is about shipping something that's useful to a customer.
Yeah, I think culture is an important part of guardrails as well, because you're either like rowing upstream against the culture, or the culture is like aligned with you and you're all going in the same direction, and depending on where you are, you're kind of stuck with the engineering culture you have. So your guardrail approach has to be built around the culture that you have. You can make incremental improvements to the culture if you think it's wrong. You're not allowed to say that out loud because people will get mad at you. But you have to start and meet the developers where they are, not you where you wish they would be. That's why I really like the drop-in functionality replacement guardrails, because they kind of work everywhere as a first step. So if you identify like the worst problem your software has, whether it's server-side request forgery or cross-site scripting or whatever, you pick your worst thing and you go, if I gave these people an ergonomic solution for the worst problem we have, would they use it? And you just solve that one problem first and then go from there.
I totally agree.
You're fine. Go ahead.
I totally agree. I also think that there's like a certain level of maturity required if you're going to use guardrails. Like, I had someone asking about it, and they're like, why isn't every single company use guardrails? I'm like, because lots of them have like a million vulnerabilities in the backlog and are just trying to get developers to not use like disastrous things. Like, I worked with a company where they were allowing their customers to send them scripts. They had no review process, and then they would just execute them against production databases with full execution privileges. And imagine trying to put a guardrail there. Like, I don't know. I feel like there's like certain levels required of like maturity depending upon how many guardrails or what type of guardrails you're going to have. Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, building on what you're saying too, I think it can depend on the maturity of the company too. You mentioned, I think, shipping code to production, and I think like I've seen varying aspects in a company's life cycle. When you start at a startup and you're building, like you're just trying to ship code and get someone to use it. Whereas once you get to a little bit later stage and you start getting customers, you then have to go back and make sure that you're meeting certain security guidelines and shipping that code. Ideally, you try and build it secure by default. But yeah, I think different personas of like whether you're building something new versus whether you're working on something that's been around for a long time or at a big company can completely dictate what guardrails you even consider using, or can. And that a lot of times, I think, Kurt, ties to the culture piece that you were talking about, right, as well. As far as what things are possible to insert or implement within a project or a code base.
Wow. These are all such well thought out answers. And I just wanted to move on to the next question. What is a paved road and how do we help developers stay on them? I saw your mouth move, Tanya.
It helps if you like sort of like long, because we're talkers. We're all going to try to talk at once. I consider a paved road like and a secure default sort of the same thing. Like the idea of this is a pre-thought out thing by the security team that we'd like you to do. Like we want you to do it this way. So a secure default could be that by default, like it forces you to set up multi-factor authentication on owner accounts in the cloud, or it could be, you know, we want you to follow our secure coding guideline, and like we have some sort of set of defaults that try to push you there. Sometimes people say like the most secure way is the secure default, but I feel like a default's like a setting, like a technical setting, if that makes sense. What does everyone else think? Patrick, do you want to go and then Kurt?
Sure. Yeah, I think like the biggest example in this kind of customer example as well, or like a company example. I think of things like a paved road would be like we're using the latest, you know, golden image, base image that's like fully up to date, patched, you know, limited vulnerabilities. That type of stuff. You know, when we're building new, right? Or we're going to update these things in this frequency. But yeah, having clear definition, and then you know, trying to ensure that there's security by default. You know, what are your practices when you're adding additional open source packages would be an example. So maybe having some, I guess that gets back to guardrails, but some guidance on you're likely going to use these things in this way and implement them to ensure that we have some baseline level of security.
What about you, Kurt?
So I have a answer that I feel is like similar, but also very different from the other two panelists. And that's, to me, paved roads are a set of processes and tooling that help developers build standardized secure software based on architecture, tools, and design patterns that have been pre-audited by security teams. The idea here is paved roads help you go faster, and also like the guardrails are at the edges of the paved road, right? Like the idea is you're staying on the paved road, which is like security built the like, this is the happy path for you, and if you do these things, we will bother you the least, which means you can go faster. And I've seen that kind of approach work before with re-arc to GraphQL from REST. We had a bunch of problems migrating to that, partially because a lot of the tooling for doing that is bad. That's a different conversation. But anyway, GraphQL doesn't have authorization as part of the specification. Like it's not built into the specification. You have to bolt it on as a kind of an aftermarket feature. And we had a bunch of problems with a lot of the early experimental services. And I was like, this is terrible. We're going to be whacking these moles forever unless we like build authorization into like the templates that everyone uses. So it's like, I want to go build a GraphQL service. Like, great, here's the template repository, and it has all the things you need, like the tooling, the dependencies, like here's how you, like we have decided on the technology we're using for authorization for GraphQL. It's like pre-added. All you have to do is define your like schema directives and you're done. And that worked really super well. We had a bunch of really consistent services that all behaved the same. The other thing that's really nice about this that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough is if you have developers that build really super consistent services, all of the services look the same, and it's really easy to audit them from a security engineer perspective. If you're having to do a whole lot of context switching because like you've got like 10 Java microservices and then 10 more Kotlin microservices that are built completely differently, and then a PHP stack and a .NET stack and all that stuff, and everything is built like with like these bespoke design patterns, and everything is just crazy town all the time. You spend a lot of time just figuring out what the hell is going on, and that cognitive load gets lowered when it's like, okay, 90% of our backend processes are like this Java architecture, and like we always use this specific like factory pattern, or we always use this manager pattern. So when I drop into like any random microservice, I know, okay, here's where I'm going to find the business logic that matters, because this section is all factory abstractions and this section is all manager abstractions, and like here's where the actual like interesting stuff happens, which makes reviewing very large surface areas of code a lot easier and more tractable for a human.
Wow, these are all really great answers. And I just want to say, like, moving on, what type of guardrails make sense with the development team? And could you give examples?
Who?
If Patrick, you'd want to start off.
Well, I gotta think about this one.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I hate to
one of you can go. I'll think.
I
a
have
little
some
bit more.
ideas. Or Kurt, do you want to go and then I'll go?
Sure. So the unfortunate answer is it depends. Like the easiest guardrails for a specific development team are often context specific, right? Like as I mentioned earlier, you usually have like a big like elephant in the room problem that has been a recurring issue for your team, and that one is going to be like the highest ROI thing to go tackle because your development team keeps messing it up, either because they don't care or they don't know or some mix of the two, or your training is bad, or there's a lot of reasons to get on, but like you're going to have like one thing that kind of stands out, and I would choose that behavior. And again, because I'm going to take a very like development code focused approach to this, I'm like pick your most dangerous behavior and find or build a wrapper library that is simple and effective for your use case. And the for your use case is really important because there isn't like a one size fits all safe library for like anything ever. Like we know this because React tried to build dangerously set inner HTML to keep people from doing that. And we have a rule for that in Semgrep, and we have seen the telemetry from a whole bunch of users on how often that gets fixed and versus ignored. And the stats are not great. So there's a lot of people who are like, I know this is bad and dangerous, but I need this escape hatch functionality for reasons. And so your approach for a guardrail needs to like really take into the consideration like how your product works and how your developers work. Again, like going to that culture and ergonomics thing, because if it's onerous and terrible to do, they're just not going to do it. And if they don't do it, then you have accomplished nothing.
Are you saying a lot of developers are like YOLO?
I'm saying that developers get measured on shipping code, not shipping secure code. And the things you ask them to do don't get them promoted or raises or bonuses. And so there's very little motivation for them to listen to you if listening to you is directly at odds with bonuses, raises, promotions, etc. You want to make sure that you are not actively making their life worse, because if you are, they will be like YOLO and not listen to you. Like you want to be partners.
I actually think this is the biggest issue in most organizations that I see, right? And talking to a lot of security teams, they're like, why won't the developers just listen to me, right? And I think one is like, well, they never sit down and actually understand the developers' workflows. They don't understand the developer tooling. They grab information from third-party tools to tell developers that they don't know what they're doing. And they lack context, right? And so I just think like, yeah, ultimately like one of the biggest problems I see with security teams is like they actually need to spend more time with developers and with engineering teams to understand how things actually work, because they often don't. And that includes myself. Like I'm not really a developer by trade. But yeah, it's literally like sitting with engineers and sitting with product teams and engineering leadership to understand like, what's going on and what's priority for them, and having those discussions about what's priority.
I agree completely. I want to add some examples. So I have run into secure guardrails by accident. Like when I worked at Microsoft, I was creating a demo and it was intentionally vulnerable. So I had my connection string, which had my password in it, to the database on purpose. And this was a demo that was, off the production network. in its own little pool, and like with no real data in the database. And like the entire purpose was to give a demo of what not to do. And I go to check my code in, and Azure DevOps is like, nah, there's a secret in there. And I'm like, yeah, I know, I put it there. and it's like, no. And I'm like, yes. And it's like, no. And I'm like, I'm a developer. You will do as I say. So I force it in, and I start my CI/CD, and I like, forget it, just go anyway. And so I go out to prod, like pretend prod, not real Microsoft prod. And then my boss calls me, and he's like, Azure just phoned me and told me that you put a secret in production. What are you doing? And then I explain what I'm doing. And both of us were laughing, like, haha, Azure's mad at you. And then we're like, Azure can make phone calls? What? And so then I got a beep. I'm like, oh, I gotta let you go. I have a beep. And I answer, and it was the incident response team, and they were pissed. They're like, what have you done, Janca? And I'm like, it's not a real secret. Like the database contains like 3 test records that I made up. Like, you know, like I have all these security precautions to make sure this demo doesn't attack anything else. And they're just like, you need to tell us first. I'm like, I didn't even know this was a whole thing. And so that is not the way I wanted to meet that person for the first time. Would have liked to meet her at a party or something instead. But so like, that's an example of like, when you check your secrets in, you could have a guardrail that's like, hey, you're checking your code in and it looks like there's a secret in there. That's a bad idea. Or like Kurt was saying with his code. So I'm writing my next book, and I have like this section on JavaScript, and there's all these parts. Like, so I'm reading my notes, but like, don't, use text content or create element instead of inner HTML or outer HTML. Like those are safer options. And a lot of the times you can use the other one. So having a guardrail that pops up and it's like, hey, you're using inner HTML. Maybe you should use this instead. Or, create element or append child instead of document.write. Like it covers a lot of use cases, not every use case, but like consider using this instead. Or if you're using infrastructure as code, like you scan them, like, they go to check it in, you scan it, and it's like, hey, you're not following a bunch of policies you're supposed to. So I'm going to add, the security header. This should be there for everyone. Like HSTS, like forcing encryption and redirecting from HTTP. Like that's an easy win. It's not going to break anything. It's like, I'm sorry you forgot this. Boom, don't worry, I put it in for you. Like I feel like guardrails can sometimes do the work for you, or just like kind of be like, that was a bad idea. Don't do that. But if it's, like you're saying, Patrick, if it's really painful, or like you're saying, Kurt, if you have 400 deadlines, we need to make it really easier. It's not going to go. But so those were some examples I was thinking of what you can do. I find that like Kurt said, every organization is different, but anyway, those are some thoughts.
I mean, when you talked about the Azure instance, I was like, oh man, you should have put that in your own AWS instance, was my initial thought. But that's the exact thing. Like the security team, they're doing the right thing looking for this stuff, but then it also incentivizes change behaviors where it's like, oh man, a demo environment would make sense for me to just sign up for an AWS account on my own and do. Unfortunately, I'm not encouraging that. But I think that's some of the logic, right, that we have to make decisions on. If like I need to give a demo of a security control break. And so, these become at real odds, in real world scenarios very often, frequently. Maybe we don't talk about that enough.
I was doing a security test once, and like the domain name suddenly changed from like my client's domain to like AWS dot blah, 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 blah. And then it like a few pages later, it switches back. And like the co-op student had like bought a bunch of AWS because she didn't want to wait in line for a server, and like just like took us out of the domain and brought us back. I'm like, let me tell you 100 reasons that's not okay, Missy. That was not at Microsoft though. I think that if I like made an insecure demo in AWS while I worked at Microsoft and then showed that off, I don't know if that would have gone very well. But anyway, I totally get what you mean.
I think moving on, if we could discuss how can we work with the development team to create guardrails and how do we get them on board? What are your guys' thoughts? Maybe Kurt, if you'd like to start.
Sure, I can start. Getting developers on board with guardrails is easiest if you are solving a problem that they care about. Like carrots work better than sticks, right? Like your guardrail is going to be orders of magnitude more effective if you're like, here's this like shiny thing that makes your code 10% faster or whatever. Developers love that stuff. And it's often performance or ergonomics, right? Like there are some things that just really suck to interact with. Key management services are a big one, like for secrets. This is why secrets show up in code all the time, because ergonomic key management is actually really uncommon. And so if you can like solve that, you will also solve your secrets in source, because if it's really, really easy to talk to the KMS, they're like, if it's functionally like, if it takes an extra like minute or whatever to just add a reference to the KMS and it's like pre-populated or it auto-generates secrets for environments or whatever, and they don't have to think about it, they'll just use the KMS, because then they don't have to like go issue an API key and then copy it out of the whatever service it came from and then paste it into source, which you're going to be mad about them at anyway. Like that, like kind of auto-wired behavior is like, we know it works because like Spring for Java is basically just that, but for obnoxious Java boilerplate, right? So we know this approach works. We should use it for security. So basically choose a guardrail that makes their lives easier and ideally reduces their security contact rate, right? They don't want to hear from us. Like a developer's best day is when they don't hear from security, right? They generally don't want to be talking to us about work. So choose a guardrail that makes that happen, I guess, is my TLDR. And I will, I guess, hand off to Tanya.
I feel like going back to what Patrick said earlier, it's like both of you, like the security culture really matters. So if you wanted to start with guardrails, I think I would want to start with education. Well, first of all, building some trust and getting to know some of them so they aren't like, who's that weird person with the purple hair and what's her problem? So ideally, like you're on speaking basis so they actually know you, and then do some education on what you're planning. So like if I'm going to do a secure coding guideline and hopefully pump it up into a standard at some point, I usually start with, hey, I'm going to do a guideline because I want to set expectations of what I'd like to see so that you can pass these tests and like not have to go and fix bugs because you didn't make them in the first place, right? And so I'm going to start small and very lenient and then get bigger and bigger. And so starting with, I guess, education and socialization, like bringing up the idea and then asking every single person for feedback, like, hey, I'm thinking about making a guardrail that does this, or like, you know, I did this with this team and this seems to be working well. Can I roll it out to your team? And sort of starting small and getting sort of a proof of concept going and then rolling it out bigger. And each time testing the guardrail with one or two teams before I roll it out bigger. I do that with security tools a lot, and I find there's less friction that way. And I've seen like so much friction. And I've been on the other side of that where I'm a developer and I think I'm a very nice developer and I'm doing a good job. And then security's like, we're going to scan you with this and it's going to tell you you suck. And I'm going to email you a PDF and be like, ugh, instead of actually speaking to me about it or telling me what it means or offering any advice of what I can do. Just, do you know what I mean? And so I feel like building a relationship is like a really good place to start. And then what Kurt said, like coming up with, how do I word this? So I usually have this thing I call the nightmare list. So things that are like, oh, this is so bad. I can't believe we're doing this. So I try to solve some of those with guardrails. So for instance, if I found injection in production, I'm going to go look and see if there's a lot more injection, in which case I'm going to cry. But then once I'm done crying, then it's like, maybe I need to make guardrails around that because that's a really critical problem. So kind of try to prioritize the types of issues that I'm concerned about, see if some of them I can think of a safeguard I could do and go from there. I know I talked a lot. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
No, that's all right. I mean, the biggest thing I'd add is the first thing I think about is empathy, as far as is my headphone still working?
It's amazing. Your voice.
Oh, sorry. All right, cool. My phone rang and I think it transferred over. But yeah, on the empathy side, I think it's like sitting down, understanding, what's a priority to the developer. Understanding too, like a lot of times developers in engineering will have ideas on how they can make things more secure, like individual people. And so I think if you find the right champions as well in that way, who want to build more secure code and see other people follow, that can help. And then the other thing I think is, I spent a lot of time in vulnerability management, and I think the biggest failure of vulnerability management is they harvest all this information on threat, and on impact and on risk, but that information isn't in the tools of the developers. So a lot of times they're just after the fact slapped on like, oh, your stuff is bad. And so if I look at other things that can be done to help engineering, is like trying to get them the information where they're at and the tools they're using early and often can lead to better outcomes, because now I know, like, oh, there's insecure packages or insecure information, or there's threats associated with what I'm building. So those things come to mind, from my perspective, as far as how you can like make some influence and impact and change things. But yeah, traditionally in the security side of teams, often that information is hoarded, and it's in separate tooling that a lot of times the developers don't even have access to. So yeah, some of the things that I think of.
Great
Can
answer.
can I add to that? So like a thing you said earlier was context. And so not only should we give developers that information about like, this is super high risk and it's really scary, but also the context that you're doing this thing. So for instance, like maybe, so years ago on my birthday, there was a security incident. And so I had to, on my birthday, so I really like birthdays. I'm totally up for parties. And I'm like, a party about me, sounds awesome. And so basically we had an SQL injection on this app, and it's public facing. So that's like really bad, right? But then I looked at it, and it was a select only user. None of the other things were vulnerable. The data in the database was not sensitive. Like the database had recently been hardened. There was firewalls around it and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so the data's public and we're trying to get people to read it. And they can't actually edit or delete the data. The database itself is quite hardened, so they can't attack the actual server. The server's got a firewall around it. And also this vulnerability has been in it for like at least 5 years, because this is a really old legacy app. And so I like looked at all of that and I'm like, okay, so like the risk is bad, but it's also like Saturday night at a certain time. And I'm like, I think we can monitor it until, or maybe it was Sunday night. We can monitor it until tomorrow morning when the devs come in and get them to fix it. And like, I remember someone from another governmental department really losing his mind and being like, you have to drop everything and call the entire developer team in. Like, you're just doing this because it's your birthday. I'm like, it is my birthday, and I am going to pass this off to the next incident manager because my 8-hour shift is ending. But I just, tell me how this, like what the business risk is of this. Like, yes, obviously we need to fix it. It's embarrassing, but it's been embarrassing for 5 years. It's been like this. And like, this data is already on the internet, and we're actually actively trying to get people to read it, and they're not reading it. And so like, I'm like, how does this cause organizational risk other than it's embarrassing that we have a vulnerability? And we've had this for years, right? So what's the difference between like now or 18 hours from now, besides thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of overtime and a whole bunch of disgruntled devs? And he's like, you're a disgrace. And he was really upset. But then everyone else agreed with me later when they all came into the office and didn't have to work all night. But yeah, like giving them actual legit context as to how serious it really is. Because sometimes I see AppSec folks where they're like, the sky's falling. And it's like, yeah, but that app doesn't have any sensitive data. It's only accessible on the intranet. Like it doesn't even do anything mission critical. And like, yeah, if that was public facing, I'd be concerned, but how is this going to hurt our business? Right. And especially if it's going to cost a lot to fix. It's like, anyway, rant over.
No, but thank you so much for providing your insight and your perspective. I guess just moving on, within a technical perspective, how do we make a guardrail and how can we enforce them? And maybe we can start off with Kurt, Patrick, Tanya.
Sure. My biggest thing that I have seen, I have seen this too many times, so I'm going to rant about it now. Stick to your core competencies. Please don't like build an IDP if you don't have to. Like if you're not like Auth0, like you have no business building an IDP, an identity provider, like an OAuth identity provider. Like that is a big complicated spec, and you're going to have to support OpenID Connect and SAML, really, if you're going to do it for enterprise folks. So just know there's a lot of like cryptography moving parts and stuff in that. I have seen things that were built correctly and still ended up accidentally like serializing all of the key pairs to disk and then leaving them there. There was an IDP server that had 8 gigabytes of RSA private keys on it. Like it was not good. Thanks, bouncycastle.net. Really appreciate that because somebody didn't like look at the Microsoft crypto APIs hard enough. Anyway, so only build if you have to. Like, please, like buy or borrow something most of the time because like you're like, well, blah blah blah, supply chain, blah blah blah, low quality component. I'm like, okay, yes, but like if it's a 10-year-old authorization component, people have been hammering on it for 10 years because it's been out there and a meaningful target. And so they fixed a lot of the stupid mistakes you're gonna make while building your own. So just don't do it. Choosing safe by default technologies or libraries is always easier and cheaper than writing your own wrapper. So instead of, I'm going to pick on Java here for a minute because Java just refuses to fix XML parsing. If you're going to parse a lot of XML, maybe choose any other language that has the safe by default XML parser. I guess Python is technically also not on this list because you have to use XML safe or whatever the Python XML one is. But .NET has had secure XML parsing since like 4.5.2, I think, which is a long time ago, and I'm realizing that I have gray hairs because of that. But anyway, and you can also, if you choose something like that has a like safe by default, easy to detect wrapper, you can use a static analysis tool. I work for Semgrep, so I'm biased, but any tool that can go look for a specific usage in code of a non-standard guardrail library or functionality will be very helpful. Because again, in like the before time, in the long ago, when we built a bunch of safe wrappers, it was basically like, is there an XML document that came from the factory that isn't the safe wrapper? That's a bug. Don't do that. Like we don't care if it actually affects us. Like the policy is you use the wrapper because the wrapper builds the XML document you, the developer, need. Like we talked to developers and we're like, hey, how do we use XML here? And they're like, this is how we use XML here. We're like, great. The automated factory is going to build that document type with whatever features and none of the ones that attackers need, and everyone's going to be happy. So we were like, the policy was just, if you don't use that, you're wrong, fix it. And XML injection stopped being a thing at that company. Like it was a recurring pen test finding for years. And then we made that change and it went away and it never came back. So it does work, but you have to pick a tractable problem and stick to your guns. And I guess I will hand off to Tanya. Patrick?
Sure.
Tanya. I'll pick Tanya.
You're fun to listen to, Kurt. So I would say, so I want to sort of elaborate on something Kurt said. So he was sort of talking about anti-patterns. So the idea of having a pattern that, like a pattern is something like that you can look for, you can search for, you can grep for it, you can search for it, like using a computer, various different ways that we can search for things. And so an anti-pattern is a pattern that we know every time it just sucks, it's bad. And so, like you said, like if you're not using the one you're supposed to, then it's bad. Like I worked in a .NET shop a few times in the government, and one of the places I worked, we had created a login, like basically a complete template for every new app, because we'd always have to write a login screen because we wrote apps for all the other government departments. So we would give them apps as gifts, if that makes any sense. Like, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but anyway, so it was our job to write things for other people, and that's why we had to do so many login screens. And so this was quite a long time ago, like over a decade ago. And so we wrote a DLL, a dynamically linked library, and it would include it, and it had like dot sanitize, like dot encode, dot this, dot that. And then we would just pen test the whole thing. And so if you were putting output to the screen and then you don't have dot encode, or you're taking something from the user and then you're going to go do something, if you don't have like dot validate in there, it's like, oh, I see a problem, right? And so when it got so that we were like reviewing code before it would go to production, it's like, hey, you forgot the dot this or the dot that on the end that calls the library. And like no one would even ever think about starting a new app with the fancy template we made. And so it became easy to kind of spot where people are not on the paved road. And so a secure default, like he was saying, like could just, whether it be a static analysis tool, like it could be a secret scanner that's like, I found a secret, and every time you check your code in, it checks, right? It could be, Patrick was talking about a golden image, and it's like, you're clearly not starting with the golden image. What are you doing? So I guess any sort of technical control where you can check, and like a static analysis tool is a good one. A linter is another good one, especially like if for any of these tools, you can write your own rules. A lot of static analysis tools, you can write your own rules. And sometimes the rule you write is like 100 times better than like whatever the company wrote for you, because you know this is causing you to lose tons of sleep, and like your team really sucks at whatever this thing is, right? Or your team wants to use the DLL that you wrote, and if they're not using it, it's a problem. And that only applies to your company. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I try. Patrick?
It's good. I'm going to leave that question with you two. I think like what your perspectives you shared are good. So I don't have anything else to add.
No, that's completely fine. Can I also hear how, if you guys could share examples of how a positive security culture has been fostered within development teams and what impact it has on the secure implementation of guardrails?
Oh yeah. I mean, I can, building security companies, it's a little bit easier because naturally you have a bias towards security. And so from my perspective, a lot of times this starts from like a top, it has to be driven by leadership to some extent. We're seeing that with Microsoft even right now, right? In Satya, the CEO there, but generally speaking, like it has to be a priority for the company. If it's not a priority, then it's generally hard to move the needle. Often it becomes a priority after a series of security incidences. And so, naturally it's like, yeah, for many organizations, you look at Snowflake right now, like suddenly security is really important to them. And so I think, not to put shame on that, right? But like, sometimes it takes externalities to actually change from a cultural perspective, and incorporate better security culture. And then I think the other thing is like, okay, yeah, maybe you don't have leadership support, or it's not a top level priority. I think it's becoming more of a top level priority with everything going on. But I generally think like the best thing you can do is try and have conversations with people, understand their perspective of security, what things are they doing, because generally I think people wanted to ship more secure code. A lot of times they just might not know how. And so I think it's taking that approach and realizing like trying to force change on people immediately usually isn't a great approach. I think you mentioned, Kurt, like it's better to use a carrot than a stick. So if you can find things that genuinely people are interested in, ways to help them move the needle, help them learn, I think that helps a ton from a culture perspective.
Do any of you guys want to chime in? Tanya, Kurt?
I will
I
chime
can.
in. Oh, Kurt, you go
Like,
first.
I can add something that I found that adding security concerns as part of like the design phase of like, hey, we're gonna go build this thing. Like, it's a lot easier to make it like obviously top down like executive driven security culture is really important, but you can also like sideload it in by making it a design requirement that and you don't even have to like obviously like as an AppSec person I have opinions about like what security is like. So a lot of times I would go in with like, okay, we're going to make it a requirement that users can only read their own data for this service, right? Like that seems like a like, duh, that's stupid. Why do we have to say that out loud? But what happens if you don't make that a requirement? Then someone like doesn't think about, oh, we should like make sure the caller of this REST API actually owns the resource that they're requesting. And then you get like IDOR vulns all over the service, right? And that's a thing. Obviously, like I pick on these specifically because they require app context. So when you're like sitting in this room designing this feature, it requires the context around the business and the application to like do these things. And also dynamic scanners and pen testers and stuff won't find these because they have incomplete or non-existent app context. So tooling won't help you. Like middle of the road pen test shops won't help you because like there are really excellent pen test consultancies and there are middling pen test consultancies and there are not so great pen test consultants. Like it's always going to be a spectrum, right? And the really good ones are really expensive. And sometimes the business isn't willing to shell out NCC money. So you're not necessarily going to get those sorts of findings that like really knowledgeable users of the product will find. Actually, side note, customer support people, really great source of security bugs because they talk to customers all the time and customers will report things. They're like, hey, I tried to load a document and I got Joe Schmo's document instead of mine. And they're like, that's wrong. I wanted my document, but that user may not understand what they have found. So you should talk to your support people if you don't already, because they might know some like juicy, terrifying stuff that you don't already know about. But going back to that, just adding like design as a guardrail is actually really effective because a lot of engineers are just like, especially people who are like, I'm a senior engineer, I've been a senior engineer for 15, 20, 25 years. I just really like building widgets in Ruby or whatever. I have no aspirations for technical leadership or whatever. I just like really like building widgets to spec, and it gives me the warm fuzzies when I build something to spec and it runs and I ship it to production. Those people just don't care. They just really like the spec. And so make sure the spec is complete and has like security properties, because then those people will build secure code because the spec says so. So use that to your advantage, I guess, is kind of the takeaway here. And I guess I will hand off to other people and talk. Tanya, I know you had something to contribute.
I was a dev and I hated the security team for the longest time. I literally would hide under my desk to avoid them. I called them the Department of No. I felt like it was literally their entire purpose in life to thwart my efforts to get to production. Like it was just like, they'd just be like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, okay, what can I do? I have to accomplish this. They're like, you should know. And, eventually I realized they didn't know. And that's why they were so closed and unhelpful. And so then one day, this lady named Alicia started, and I remember she came to a meeting and she's like, hi, I'm your security human. I'm going to follow you through this whole project. I don't know everything, but I can find things out. And I will be here the whole way. I will answer questions. I will, hire the pen tester, make sure the scan gets run, do all the things. And I was like, yeah, we'll see. But then she was great. And she ended up being incredibly brilliant. And like, we lost her very quickly because she was like way out of our league. And like, it is very, 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 very high up, leading giant security things for the Canadian government now. But basically, like, she would admit if she didn't know something. She'd be like, I don't know, but I do know doing that way causes high risk. So let's book a meeting. Let's brainstorm. I'm going to invite a bunch of smart people. We'll find the answer together. And I'd never dealt with a security person that I guess listened to me before and like didn't give up and wasn't an insecure a-hole. And so like that really changed my mind on a lot of things. And so then when I switched to security, I saw a lot of my colleagues and the way they behaved. And I was like, it sounds weird, but like, I would always feel like, well, I'm a dev. I'm one of them. And I remember one of my bosses saying once, it's like you care more about them than us. And I'm like, maybe I do. Like, she's like, you're always on their side. I'm like, we're wrong. And like being able like to have that empathy, because like more of my life still was software development than security. Even like 10 years in, there's still way more dev time in my life. And so I feel like being able to have that empathy and understand and listen, and it doesn't mean you had to have been a dev. It just means you have to be a person that has empathy and can pay attention. And instead of saying no, I don't know if you've ever heard of improv, you're supposed to say yes and. So you're like, that causes a ton of risk. Let's find something together that causes less risk, a risk that we can accept together, right? And so you're still saying no, right? You're still not going to go do the terrifying thing, but you've agreed to go on this journey with them to find a better path. And so for me, I found that brought everything together really, really nicely. And I know you said we're almost out of time, Charissa.
Yeah, we are unfortunately out of time. Patrick, if you want to add like one quick liner or anything, feel free to.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is you mentioned, Kurt, support being a great resource. I think too, encouraging engineers and developers to engage with customers, because having those intimate relationships, especially if you're developing products, right, helps you catch things much, much easier. Beta programs, things of that nature, which can work out great as well. So yeah, it's been fun.
Wow, thank you so much for all of you guys' amazing answers. One final question for the panel, and I know we're slightly running out of time, but what are some key takeaways you want the audience to take home? And tell us where the audience can find you. We want to learn more about you, so please let us know. And we can start off with Kurt, Tanya, Patrick.
I guess my takeaway is you want your developers to be your friends, like, because friends tell you things, and people who are afraid of you run in the opposite direction when you show up. And security is basically like being a spy, but for code. Like your currency is knowledge. Like your whole job is literally know about things. like your security champions program is just like assets you have in potentially hostile foreign governments. Like there's actually a lot of like tradecraft mapping between like intelligence and like being good at AppSec, because not being surprised makes you really effective. You can find me on Mastodon on infosec.exchange. I'm at Lapdoor, or you can email me at kurt@semgrep. Those are kind of the two places I am most active. But yeah, and like talk to people, build relationships. When I land at a new company doing AppSec stuff, the first thing I do is book meetings with like all the EMs I can find and go, give me a TLDR history of your service, like top to bottom. Like, why was it built? Who has worked on it? How does it run? Where does it live in production? What does it do today? And what are the plans for the future? And then and then wildly scribble notes. And because like, one, you're building a rapport with this person, you're asking them for their expertise. So you're like, yes, I clearly know that you know more about this than me. Tell me about it. And also it really quickly builds you a map of what you need to secure. And I will pass it off to Tanya.
Awesome. So I think I want to reiterate what Kurt said as my thing. Developers, be nice to developers and build trust, like real trust. And then you'll get so much further in your AppSec goals every time. And if you want to find more about me, if you just look up She Hacks Purple, that's my website, that's my YouTube, that's my Twitter, that's my everything. You can generally find me there. Also, if you want to see a bunch of lessons I've made, go to academy.semgrep.dev, because we have a free online academy that I built, and there's a lot of cool stuff in there. Patrick?
It's great. You can find me on LinkedIn, patrickmgarrity.com. And I guess the biggest takeaway, I think, building close relationships across your development team, your product team, if you're building products, and understanding, where there's opportunity to improve and how to make a big impact and focus on those things. So.
Wow, thank you so much for our amazing panelists. You guys were amazing. And yes, the audience, please feel free to connect with them. And also, these Semgrep academies are free and they're amazing, cool learning tools. So I highly recommend that. And yeah, thank you so much for coming to today's event. And hopefully see you guys at our next webinar. Have a great day, everyone.